Welcome to our interview with Professor Jane Freedman. Thank you so much for joining us, Jane. Professor Jane Freedman is a British-French sociologist and professor of politics at the Paris 8 University, as well as deputy director of the Center for Sociology and Political Research in Paris. Her research themes are gender, gender-based violence, refugees, political asylum, and political migration, with a focus on contemporary EU migration and refugee policy. So Jane, you call for a gendering of the asylum and refugee debate. Why is that?
Well, I think often when we speak about refugees or asylum seekers or migrants more generally, then we often talk about individuals without thinking, or we talk about groups of people without thinking about their individual characteristics, identities, situations, or experiences. And in fact, we can talk about crisis of refugees arriving, a so-called crisis, but these groups of people, but without thinking that actually they're individuals who have a specific gender identity, sexual orientation, they have a particular social class, religion, race, nationality, and that all of these factors will impact on their experiences of migration, their experiences of crossing borders, their experiences of arriving in a different country. So, for example, just to take a very simple example, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the international convention which governs refugee law in many countries, the definition of a refugee doesn't include any reference to gender, so that when, for example, women come and seek asylum because of the domestic violence, gender-based violence, for example, there's nothing in that convention, which was supposedly meant to apply to all, a neutral policy to apply to all, but there's nothing in that convention which actually covers their situation. So it creates a void, it creates a situation where certain forms of violence, of discrimination, of inequality are ignored. And similarly, when we think about the experiences of refugees today, things like gender-based violence, which will, anyone can be, there are lots of types of violence which refugees experience, but there are specific forms of violence which women, for example, will experience more than men. And if we don't think about that, and if we don't think about the different social structures of inequality and discrimination within which individuals find themselves, then we can't really fully understand the experiences of migrants and refugees, and we can't respond as well to their needs, or to try and reducing their vulnerability and their risks of violence.
Thank you for that very clear answer. In your research, you mentioned different levels of gender-based violence that are perpetrated against, for example, women on the move. Could you maybe elucidate a bit on those levels of violence and where, especially also women on the move, experience those types of violence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge range of different forms of violence and types of violence that people on the move experience, and that women will experience particular forms of violence. And I think often perhaps we focus on, very obvious forms. Well, firstly, people experience violence in their countries of origin, and that's one of the reasons, one of the major reasons why people move, or people leave their countries and move to try and seek protection in another country, because of different forms of violence. So it could be through war, it can be sexual violence, it can be a huge range of forms of gender-based violence, including, for example, domestic intimate partner violence, also, perhaps forced marriages or female genital mutilation. It could be economic or political violence. So a huge range of reasons why people are forced to leave their country. And then while they're moving, violence which can be physical, it can be gendered violence, it can be sexual violence, but it also can be violence which comes from economic violence, not having enough food, the terrible conditions, living conditions. So huge range of different forms of violence which exist while people are on the move, and also when they arrive in a country of destination, in host countries, if we see the conditions within which asylum seekers and refugees live in many contemporary European countries, for example, in refugee camps where they have, there have been lots of reports, for example, in the camps in the Greek islands, in Lesbos, for example, where there is overcrowding, unhygienic conditions. There's a lot of gender-based violence because there's just, for example, no lighting in those camps. So conditions of insecurity, sexual violence against women, not enough bathroom conditions, people don't have enough food. All of these kind of conditions, and it's not just in Greece, that was just an example, and also symbolic violence, which comes from racism and discrimination within the countries, these host countries. So again, within Europe, if we talk about the European example, but it's also true of the US or other countries which are hosting asylum seekers and refugees, there's we know resurgence of racism and xenophobia, which also has a huge impact, and which provokes not just physical violence, but also symbolic violence and discrimination against people on the move. And for women, that can have, specific forms. For example, women who wear hijab, for example, experience particular forms of discrimination, and there are stereotypes and representations around issues of, religion, Muslim women being particularly, having no agency, being particularly backwards because of they're seen as dominated, they're seen as not being able to make their own decisions, which is again also, I would say, another form of violence against them.
Thank you. So we're actually talking about a big host of perpetrators of violence, because generally when we think about gender-based violence, at least in the context of our work, we're very much thinking about partners. But in this case, there's so many different levels at which there are different people perpetrating violence against people on the move, and also systemic violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge level of systemic violence in the policies, in European policies of closing borders, for example, and the EU. I'm taking the example of the EU, but this is true of many other settings. But if we look at Europe at the moment, continually there have been a closure of borders, securing of borders, so it's more and more difficult for anyone to arrive legally, which creates a system. This is a political system of violence and repression, which means that it's hugely expensive to try and cross borders. You can't cross the borders on your own. It's very difficult. You have to pay somebody. It becomes very expensive. So then there's a question of who has resources, and often we know that women would have fewer economic resources, which creates a problem. There's also violence from the people who border police. Just from my own work, interviewing people, recently I was interviewing people who are trying to arrive in Europe from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Iraq, from a huge variety of destinations. These people have traveled, crossed many borders, and they were talking about the violence that they experience from, for example, the border police at those borders. But there's also violence from smugglers, from people that are helping the smugglers. It's a difficult question because they're often kind of scapegoated by politicians who say smugglers are the whole problem. The smugglers are there because it's impossible to cross a border without smugglers. But it creates a situation where these smugglers also can exert violence on the people that they're helping to the people on the move, the refugees and the migrants. So, and then there are lots of examples of sexual violence against women by these smugglers, or also things like asking for sexual relations in return for border crossings. If people don't have money, then they have to pay in other ways. So there's lots of transactional sexual relationships. All of these forms of violence, and then there violence within, amongst the people on the moves themselves, because within families, there can be intimate partner violence, which is often not recognized, because people, for example, NGOs who work with refugees will see, okay, we're going to work with a family group, and they don't often look within the family group to see, what are the relations of power, what are the relations of violence. And often these family groups are very big, because people band together, women, especially women traveling on their own, who have huge risks of sexual gender-based violence would group up with, perhaps a man to travel with or a group of men to travel with to try and gain protection. But that can be a source of violence. So those people can be perpetrators. So it's hugely complicated. And there are, a huge range of different perpetrators. And all of this is facilitated by state political systems, which create situations of vulnerability.
You already started mentioning kind of some of the central actors in the situation that we're in, and making the situation worse for refugees. And I guess I'm wondering, and this is a huge question, I'm aware it's a huge question, but if there were like 3 things that you could say that from your opinion, from your vantage point of view, would help make the situation better for people on the move and decrease the violence that they're experiencing, what would those be?
Well, ideally, in an ideal world, would be to open up borders and not have these hugely militarized and securitized borders, which are a huge problem. And I know that that's probably unlikely to happen at the current time. So that's probably a wish. But I think really looking, to try and decrease even within the situation that exists, is to look not just to characterize people. Often women, for example, are characterized as inherently vulnerable, or, but to really look and to understand the experiences of people on the move, to listen to them and to ask what they need they need in terms of protection, and to open up, for example, to think about, break down these family groups and not assume just because the woman's traveling with a man, then she'll be protected by that man, and to really open up much more, because there are very few recourse for people, for women that have been victims of gender-based violence. Often they can't go to the police, or they're scared to go to the police. There's no one to talk to. Language can be a problem, or so to open up. And in some countries, for example, shelters like women's shelters or shelters for people who've experienced intimate partner violence, domestic violence, aren't open or accessible for migrant women. So there's very little help and support. So really to try and go beyond the stereotypes or the, categorizing women are vulnerable, or Muslim women are vulnerable, or again, also there's a very often culturalist discourse that, these migrant women have different culture and that's the root of the problem. But to go beyond that, to really think, to involve migrants and refugees, to talk to them, to understand what their needs are, to understand why they're vulnerable, and then to provide these kind of very basic, forms of support. So open up services for victims of gender-based violence to migrants. Think about interpretation, think about, how that can be accessible for them. And I think that would be really important.